In August 2005, Hurricane Katrina became one of the most devastating disasters in American history. After Hurricane Katrina, Mississippi faced unimaginable loss. But amid the destruction, it also sparked innovation, resilience, and lasting change. Out of devastation came the foundation for modern disaster recovery. For the first time, CDBG-DR programs were built from the ground up, creating a model that would guide community recovery efforts nationwide. And IEM leaders pioneering work in Mississippi, developing innovative disaster recovery frameworks and implementation strategies, established the gold standard for how America rebuilds stronger after disasters. This is the story of recovery and resilience after Katrina.
We had about 75 miles of coastline that was impacted at Katrina. We had surge of record levels, records of the United States at the 30-foot. It's like a giant tidal wave that came in. It destroyed entire communities, bridges, roadways. About 130,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. We had over about 250 lives that were lost during the storm. Just awful. We had 1 million of the 3 million people in Mississippi were impacted. A third of the population here were impacted. More than 50% of our counties in Mississippi, in fact, 47 of the 82 counties were impacted and received federal assistance.
Every chamber office was destroyed across the coast. When we woke up the next day, 200 people were dead, more were missing, and all communications were lost. And really the entire 75-mile beachfront was devastated.
We knew this was, after it hit, that this was one of the worst disasters that had ever hit the continental United States at that time. Prior to Katrina's hitting, we still didn't really realize how bad it was going to be in terms of the storm surge. That's what really was bad during Katrina, more so than the wind speed.
We didn't think there could be any hurricane as bad as Camille. Katrina was multiples as bad. I flew over the coast the morning after the storm, utter obliteration, as if an atomic bomb had gone off in the sound. And what I was seeing was not only horrific, but it was everywhere. And so we went to work immediately with 3 critical goals: get housing back, quality housing, get jobs back. The third goal was schools, that if people didn't have a place for their kids to go to school, they wouldn't come back. And our goal was to get people back fast and make them optimistic that the coast was going to be better than it had ever been before. And we accomplished that.
In Katrina's case, it was such a widespread disaster, and it just pretty much destroyed everything along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, at least from the coastline to the railroad tracks inland, which actually served as a barrier because it's an elevated railroad track. So it kind of broke the storm surge, and so everything north of there was pretty much roof damage and debris, but south of it was nothing but flat.
And my goal was to support, Governor Barber and his team and coordinate all the federal pieces, whether they be, SBA, Department of Transportation. And there's a lot that the federal government can do, besides FEMA grant programs under Stafford. And I think sometimes, during the response, we've got the emergency support functions and, we're mission assigning, the different agencies and departments to do stuff. But in the longer term recovery, we need to still be the glue to coordinate all those federal agencies in support of the governors.
I went to work at the Mississippi Development Authority under Governor Barber as part of a team specifically tasked with implementing these long-term recovery projects and within that $5.4 billion CDBG appropriation.
When the governor and some of the local leaders, about 3 years into recovery, I had a group of the local Gulf Coast Business Council and some of the housing advocates and the business leaders. We went to see the governor and said, we need a housing czar of some kind to really get this moving. So long story short, the governor called me about 2 weeks later and said, that idea, Gerald, I can't find anybody, you've got to do it. So for about 4 years, that's what I did. And I was really supervising the overall CDBG program for housing, the housing portion.
But really what he did was he brought architects and city planners, all this from all over the world, Europe, and to sit down with the community, formal, structured meetings to try to see what the community wanted to look like, and then using approaches maybe that were successful in New Zealand or or France or somewhere else to see what you could make those fit, in the Gulf Coast, Mississippi.
One of the things that I've learned is that after, I think I managed 16 presidential disasters, and Katrina just happened to be the one that stands out, that every disaster is totally different. There's always, when you look at what FEMA has and what the programs are, one of the things I think that we did during Hurricane Katrina that was unique is that, it provided the opportunity to think outside the box, because there was no program, no plan that was big enough to solve the problems of Katrina.
One of the things that made Katrina, I think, somewhat unique and changed a lot of the national policies was the very effective use of combining all federal funding sources for recovery, as well as donations and charitable organizations and things of that nature. One of the things we're most proud of in our work in Mississippi was the fact that we were able to utilize the FEMA Public Assistance Grant funding, hazard mitigation grant funding, along with the Community Development Block Grant to, as Governor Barber liked to say, to rebuild the coast better than it was before.
So all in total, we received $5.4 billion. In today's dollars, that's probably worth about, consumer price index, probably around $8.9 billion. We restored 40,000 homes with that funding. We created some and retained some 8,000 jobs and completed over 300 public infrastructure projects in an expedited manner. Within 5 years, we'd spent $4 billion of the $5.4 billion. Most of the housing stock had been recovered. 48,000 FEMA trailers were gone. Temporary housing was out of the way. All of it done and completed with an error rate of less than 0.1%. These programs that were designed now are being emulated. They're being used today some 20 years later.
The use of waivers and action plan amendments really tailored our program to what we needed in Mississippi at that time. Our waivers and things that we got from HUD allowed us to suspend the public services deadline. So we were able to assist people more with food and shelter and case management longer. It allowed us to construct new housing, which is not normal for regular CDBG funding. So it really did allow us to do some things that we weren't sure that we were going to be able to do at first. The use of waivers and action plan amendments really helped to prop up our program.
The first, lesson learned from Katrina was that we needed a vehicle in terms of recovery, in terms of accessing federal recovery dollars, because this was a national disaster that was beyond just the FEMA formula funds. The fact that you needed a flexible federal funding source and to fund some of these recovery programs, that was found in CDBG. Our delegation and HUD worked with HUD to come up with waivers and ways to make that existing program apply to these needs.
HUD money couldn't go to an administrative building, and all these towns needed a city hall. So, Washington group were able to change that, and Jon Mabry and all them, they're the ones that funneled the money to us once it was cleared from everything there.
Some of the innovations that did come out of Katrina, rather than just, FEMA trailers, we wanted to give survivors a little bit more comfortable temporary housing solution. So we put in place what we call Katrina cottages. You may see those. They're really tiny to some degree. We put nearly 2,000 of those out there. But the beauty of those were they were built extremely well, and we were able to take those and permanently place them. So you went from a temporary solution to a permanent housing solution there for some. And in many cases, the housing was much better than what these survivors had lived in previous to Katrina. So we put people in a lot better spot than they were.
One of the great ideas that's lasted to this day, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they had what they call FEMA trailers. And FEMA trailers were small, inadequate. I'll never forget my wife, Marcia, made the Speaker of the House go into a FEMA trailer to prove to him that a grown man could not turn around in the bathroom of a FEMA trailer. And so when one of the things in the charrette, a group came up with what they called the Mississippi Cottage, a far superior, slightly larger, better built, more mobile home. And more than 3,000 Mississippi families were able to live in a lot better temporary housing because the FEMA trailer was just so inferior to the Mississippi Cottage.
Recovery was going so slow. We had Katrina cottages. And so I went to nearly 60 different planning commission, city council meetings, boards of supervisors meeting, trying to convince them that this was not the right time for not in my backyard. It was the time to recognize that we had this unique situation and got them to change their zoning rules to allow these Katrina cottages to go right away because people were still living in tents and things. It was just horrible.
I think emergency managers don't really know, or they think they know what they're going to be dealing with, so they plan for those scenarios. And I can tell you that when I got on the ground in Hancock County on Wednesday, after landfall on early Monday morning, that one of the things that I encountered was Congressman Gene Taylor, who wanted me to meet with a local funeral home director, and I did. And y'all may have heard this story, but I'll tell it again because I think it reminds people that there are things that you'll have to do that you never expect to do. And he was talking about that his morgue was full and was supposed to have to start putting bodies in the parking lot and covering them with tarps. I said, I don't know what we're going to do, but we're not going to do that. And just by, as fate would have it, a gentleman drove up in a reefer trailer who had just dropped a load of ice off at Stennis Space Center, and he was looking for directions. He was a private contractor, so he owned his own truck. Bill and I looked at each other and said, well, can we rent your trailer? We need to use it. He said, what do you want to do with it? And we told him. He said, I can't do that. I'm going to have to, this is where I make my living. I can't afford to, do that. So we actually negotiated a price and bought that trailer for $25,000 on site right there. The Chancery Clerk, Tim Keller in Hancock County, wrote a check, and we kind of co-signed it saying, we guarantee you we will get you reimbursed for it. And that's, that was used as a temporary morgue until we actually got our trailers that had been ordered several days before that had not arrived. So, I tell people all the time, you better be prepared to do things that you didn't expect to do.
Set up a revolving trust fund and second mortgages, making them able so that the average homeowner doesn't have to spend more than 35%, on principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. A pretty good rule of thumb. Set it up so that it's a continuing perpetual fund, because circumstances change by community to community. Getting housing back up, schools back up, hospitals back up, of course, is critical. But housing and jobs go hand in glove, and you've got to have these kind of innovative approaches.
And every disaster is different. Every community is different. The needs of every community will be different. And really, that's what Jon Mabry did for Hancock County. He came in, he met with our officials, he met with our business owners, and he said, what do we need to do to rebuild this county better than it was? Through his leadership, we were able to get HUD and CDBG to say yes to the projects that we wanted for our community. One of the projects that we did, in addition to the Bay St. Louis Harbor, was we established a low-interest forgivable loan program for small businesses. This was unprecedented. It had not been done anywhere really in the country. We were able to provide loans anywhere from $35,000 to $150,000 per business. And that gave those businesses the hope that they needed to be able to invest their own money in rebuilding their business.
I work for a program called the Long-Term Workforce Housing Program. One of the things that I think really helps to impact housing policy today, especially around recovery, is all the various ways, the plethora of ways that you can use CDBG-DR funding for housing recovery.
I would tell you this with regards to housing, and this is a big lesson, is you have to do aggressive outreach. And you think that you're going to pick up everyone, but it doesn't happen. You're elderly, you're disabled, you're poor, non-English speaking. You have to put plans in place. We came back in and developed another program specifically for that category of population because we didn't feel our housing study suggested that we hadn't assisted all of these people, hadn't found them all. So we aggressively hunted down, working with the nonprofits and in Mississippi, the churches. And we were able to bring the people in, reconstruct their houses for them. And we did about 4,000 houses. And I'm very proud of that. That we changed people's lives.
There's no substitute for preparation. And it's not just the government preparing. Our state government, as I said, prepared from 1969 to 2005. Every year we'd have an annual planning, preparation, practice. People who did all that turned out to be planning for the wrong disaster. Katrina was nothing like Camille. It was so much worse in so many ways. Having practice helped us, even though it wasn't the same disaster we were planning for. You learn what you wanted to do and why and how. And you practice that year in and year out. You become good at it. You become where you can move faster, where you can foresee problems, where you can deal with bad mistakes. One of the chapters in my book is, if you make a bad decision, reverse the decision. You got to make decisions, particularly in a mega disaster like this. But sometimes you're going to see that turned out to be the wrong decision. Change it. Politicians don't say they had to change something. Well, if you got enough bad decisions that you got to deal with, you're going to make something wrong.
And workforce housing or affordable housing is tough during blue sky. And during the disaster, it's the workforce housing, of course, it's usually in more modest neighborhoods and stuff for lots of reasons that are whacked up the worst. The housing crisis in America has just exacerbated what we faced during disaster, especially in states where you've got a large population of minorities. And maybe it was because Representative Thompson, but he reminded me daily almost the importance of federal contracting with minority contractors to get the economy back up and running for everybody. There's a tendency to go to the big time national contractors and all that stuff. That's easy. So we had classes for minority contractors to teach, and it wasn't showing them preferential treatment. It was just trying to educate them on being competitive for contracts. It sounds easy, but for those communities that are most hard hit, to have their small industries and everything back up and running is a part of getting the entire community back to something close to normal.
They were incredibly good. Less than 0.5% of the money that the federal government gave to us, some of their programs turned out to be misspent. Less than 0.5%. I think it's the best record of any serious disaster in American history.
I had some understanding of how difficult it is for the frontline political entities, cities and counties, to deal with this huge disaster recovery and then, have to deal with federal regulations, state regulations, audits, setting up the books correctly, all these things, as each city has a different set of books, as well. Nevertheless, you got to be ready for an IG audit. So you better start off right at the beginning. And then, as my dear friend Jon Mabry will tell you, we had way less than 1%, I think is down in the hundredths of 1% of fraud out of the billions of dollars that we handled in housing. And we're kind of proud of that.
My mama used to say when I was a boy that crisis and catastrophe do not create character. Crisis and catastrophe reveal character. 960,000 Americans came to Mississippi over the 5 years after the storm to do volunteer work, to help clean up, to help rebuild. And Katrina brought out the most generous gifts and money and ways of helping. It's more than money. Nearly 1 million people came here and they gave their time, something that you can't replace.
A large amount of the doctrine that we now see in state and federal disaster recovery was developed based on what happened during Katrina and post-Katrina.
Being able to use HUD CDBG funding for the projects that we set out as priorities for our community was critical to our recovery. Without that funding, we would never have been able to rebuild the infrastructure. We would never have been able to rebuild our homes, our businesses.
When the disaster is over, the bad gets worse and the good gets worse. You see, so the trends get accelerated, but the goods can be reemphasized. That the good trend for jobs, whatever you had, whoever was hiring before that disaster, try to get more of them going, because obviously that was the place to be.
All of the people that I know that work in this field, their heart is in it. We may not be able to always give the answer people want to hear, but we try our best to not say no. One of the things that have really stood out for me is the heartfelt caring and just simply the desire to help their community and to help people rebuild their lives.
And the volunteers, that story is greater than any story you've ever seen. They didn't just send money down here. They came and stayed down in here. And this thing, you're talking about, we had no electricity, we had no water for 3 weeks, and you'd have thought they were in Miami Beach. They were just as happy as they could be. And they stayed, I'm talking, this went on for 2 years, not just one day and one night and all that. So what we learned about the American people was the greatest thing I learned from Katrina, bar none.
I guess my argument is put a team together, a realistic team, including local people who know the local lingo, so to speak. I mean, changing those zoning laws for the Katrina colleges, anybody could have done it. But for somebody to come in from Massachusetts and say you should change your zoning law, the first reaction is you know what you're talking about. And of course, even though they may know what they're talking about, it's helpful to have somebody on the ground who said, yeah, I've been there and done that. I'm one of you.
Nature has a power that we don't really comprehend until we come face to face with. And it makes us even more determined to do the best we can, to put the best science forward, to put the best data and information forward, to make the best of plan so that we can save as many lives as possible and make sure that the community is able to recover as quickly and resiliently as possible.
The legacy is really, Katrina gave us the opportunity for America to demonstrate the greatest outpouring of philanthropy and volunteerism that this country has ever seen.
Katrina was a tragedy that reshaped lives, communities, and our nation. However, its legacy endures in stronger policies, smarter recovery programs, and a commitment to never forget the lessons learned. From Mississippi and Louisiana to every community that has faced disaster since, Katrina's story continues to guide how we prepare, how we rebuild, and how we honor those we lost by building a stronger future.